My jealous colleagues fired Jake. Then I acted honestly. I never thought much about office relationships. Work was work, and I always believed in keeping my personal life separate from the 9-to-5 grind. That was until I met Jake. It was my second year at Fairview Consulting, a mid-sized marketing firm in Chicago. The job itself was nothing special. Lots of spreadsheets, endless meetings, and the occasional client presentation that either went smoothly or became a total disaster depending on how well prepared we were. My day-to-day routine had become predictable. Morning coffee from the small shop around the corner, emails, project planning, a rushed lunch at my desk, and a long commute back home. The only thing that made the office remotely interesting was the people. And one of those people was Jake. Jake had joined our team about 6 months after I did. At first, he was just another new hire, quiet, polite, and keeping to himself. But it didn't take long for me to notice how sharp he was. He had a way with numbers and strategies that made even the most complex marketing reports seem like child's play. The bosses loved him, and soon enough, he was given some of the more high-profile accounts that everyone in our department wanted a piece of. At first, I wasn't sure how to feel about him. He wasn't arrogant, but he had this effortless confidence that made it seem like he always knew what he was doing. Meanwhile, I was still double-checking my work 3 times before sending it out. It would have been easy to be resentful, but instead, I found myself wanting to learn from him. One of the first projects we worked on together was a marketing campaign for a sports apparel brand. It was the kind of project that could make or break reputations, and everyone in the department knew it. Our manager, Lauren, had split us into teams, and by sheer coincidence, or maybe design, I was paired with Jake. Working with him was an adjustment. He was precise, always focused, and had a habit of pushing back when he didn't agree with something. I wasn't used to that. Most of my previous colleagues had either gone along with the plan or avoided conflict altogether. But Jake? If he thought something wasn't working, he said so, and he wasn't afraid to argue his point. First, it annoyed me. I'd spend hours drafting a proposal, only for him to pick it apart and suggest a completely different approach. But the frustrating thing was, he was usually right. His insights made the project stronger, and I started to see the logic behind his thought process. Instead of clashing, we found a rhythm. He challenged me to think differently, and I forced him to consider ideas outside his comfort zone. Slowly, what had started as a frustrating partnership turned into something else. Mutual respect. Outside of work, we barely interacted. He had his life and I had mine. I knew he lived somewhere in the suburbs, while I was still renting a small apartment in the city. He occasionally mentioned his weekend hikes or trips out of town, while my weekends were mostly spent catching up on errands and relaxing. We weren't exactly friends, but we understood each other in a way that made working together easier. Things took a turn one afternoon when a last-minute presentation landed on our laps. A major client was flying in, and we had just 2 days to prepare a pitch. Stress levels were high, and Lauren made it clear that failure wasn't an option. Jake and I locked ourselves in a conference room, poring over data and refining our approach. It was the first time we had spent so many consecutive hours working side by side, and in between discussing market trends and engagement strategies, we started talking about other things. Small things like our favorite coffee spots, the worst bosses we'd ever had, and what we'd be doing if we weren't stuck in marketing. That was when I realized how little I actually knew about him. Beneath the sharp, analytical mind was someone who had taken a long, winding road to get where he was. He had worked in sales, dabbled in graphic design, and even spent a year traveling before settling into marketing. His drive wasn't about climbing the corporate ladder. It was about finding something he was good at and making an impact. I think that was the moment things shifted. The rivalry, the tension. It all faded into the background. We weren't just colleagues anymore. We were 2 people navigating the same chaotic work environment, trying to do the best we could. By the time the presentation rolled around, we were exhausted but ready. The pitch went better than expected, and when the client signed on, Lauren made sure to acknowledge our work. That was the first time I saw Jake actually look proud. Not just of himself, but of us as a team. That project became a turning point. We found ourselves working together more often, not because we had to, but because we worked well together. Over time, the conversations became more natural, and I started to appreciate his directness rather than be put off by it. The respect we had built through work slowly turned into something else, trust. Of course, work relationships are tricky. The office is a pressure cooker, and not everyone gets along. But every now and then, you meet someone who challenges you in the best way possible. Someone who makes you rethink the way you approach things, pushes you to do better, and reminds you why you started in the first place. For me, that person was Jake. And whether we liked it or not, Our partnership had changed the way we both worked for the better. I didn't realize how much people talked about Jake until the whispers turned into outright resentment. It started subtly, offhand comments during lunch, sideways glances in meetings, but it didn't take long for the tension to build. Jake had been performing exceptionally well, and whether he intended to or not, he had made a name for himself in the company. Senior managers noticed him. Clients requested him specifically. His ideas were being implemented, and more often than not, they worked. That kind of success doesn't go unnoticed, and unfortunately, it doesn't always sit well with everyone. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe people were just adjusting to change. But the more I observed, the more obvious it became. The marketing department thrived on collaboration, but it also had an unspoken rule: don't outshine the collective. Jake had broken that rule. He wasn't playing office politics the way others did. He didn't flatter the right people or downplay his achievements. He worked hard, delivered results, and expected the same from everyone else. And that made him a target. The murmurs turned into complaints. People started saying he was too aggressive, that he overstepped his boundaries, that he made others feel incompetent. Some of it might have been true. Jake wasn't one to sugarcoat things, but the real issue wasn't his attitude. It was his success. I saw it unfold in meetings. When Jake spoke, people rolled their eyes. When he suggested ideas, they were dismissed, only to be brought up later by someone else and suddenly deemed brilliant. His emails were scrutinized for tone. His work was picked apart in ways that no one else's was. I had been working with him long enough to know he wasn't perfect, but I also knew he wasn't the villain they were trying to paint him as. Then came the real blow. A formal complaint was filed against Jake. HR got involved. The details were vague. Accusations of being overly critical, of fostering a hostile work environment, of not being a team player. It was absurd. I had seen plenty of people in the company behave far worse without consequence. But Jake wasn't just anybody anymore. He was a rising star, and for some reason that was a problem. The worst part was that he didn't see it coming. He had been too focused on the work to notice the shifting dynamics around him. When the investigation began, he was blindsided. He tried to defend himself, but it was clear that decisions had already been made. Some people wanted him gone. I wasn't sure what to do. I wanted to speak up, but I also knew how these things worked. Once HR was involved, it wasn't about fairness, it was about optics. The company needed to show that they were addressing concerns, and if that meant letting go of one of their best employees to keep the peace, they would do it. Jake, for all his confidence, looked exhausted. He started keeping to himself more, avoiding unnecessary interactions. The fire that had made him such a force in the company was dimming. And as much as I wanted to believe it would blow over, deep down I knew it wouldn't. The people who envied him had found a way to push him out, and they weren't going to stop until they succeeded. By the time the final meeting was scheduled, Jake had made up his mind. He wasn't going to fight anymore. He told me later that he realized he had spent too much energy proving himself to people who had no intention of seeing his value. So he left. Not with a dramatic exit, not with a confrontation, just a quiet resignation letter and a handshake from Lauren that felt more obligatory than sincere. When he was gone, the office felt different. Some people acted like nothing had happened. Others seemed almost relieved. But I knew the company had lost something important. And for the first time, I started questioning the kind of place I was working in. Because if someone like Jake could be pushed out for simply being good at his job, then what did that mean for the rest of us? The day after Jake left, the atmosphere in the office felt noticeably lighter, at least for some people. I watched as small groups gathered at the coffee station, laughing and whispering, their expressions smug with satisfaction. It was clear that some of them felt like they had won, like they had rid themselves of a problem. The office had never been particularly warm, but now it felt colder, more artificial, as if any pretense of professionalism had been peeled away to reveal the pettiness underneath. First, I kept my head down. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just the way things worked. Maybe this was just another example of office politics at play. But the more I listened, the more disgusted I became. People who had once been friendly with Jake were now rewriting history, talking about how he had always been a problem, how he had deserved what happened. I couldn't believe how quickly they had turned on him. They pretended that they had been right all along, as if Jake's departure validated their jealousy and resentment. For the next few weeks, things went back to business as usual for them. Work continued, meetings happened, projects moved forward. But for me, something had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was working in a place that rewarded mediocrity and punished ambition. A place where standing out was seen as a threat rather than an achievement. It gnawed at me every single day, the realization that this wasn't about Jake. It was about the culture of the company, about the kind of people it chose to protect and the kind it chose to discard. Then one afternoon, I heard them laughing again. It was the same group, the ones who had been the loudest about Jake. They were joking about how peaceful things had been since he left, how much easier everything was now. As if he had been the problem, as if his hard work and dedication had somehow made their jobs unbearable. And that was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, walked over to their table, and let them have it. I told them exactly what I thought, that they hadn't won anything, that they had driven out someone who actually cared about his work, and that they were too blinded by their own insecurity to see it. I didn't raise my voice, but my words cut through the room like a knife. The laughter stopped. Their faces shifted from amusement to discomfort. Some of them tried to argue, to justify what had happened, but I didn't care. I had said what I needed to say. After that, I went straight to my desk and wrote my resignation letter. There was no hesitation. I wasn't going to stay in a place where people like Jake were pushed out for being too good at what they did. I wasn't going to work for a company that let jealousy dictate its decisions. If they couldn't see the value in someone like him, then they would never see the value in someone like me either. As I handed in my resignation, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I had spent so much time trying to navigate office politics, trying to fit into a system that didn't reward hard work but rather rewarded those who knew how to play the game. And I was done playing. Walking out of that office for the last time, I felt lighter. I didn't have a plan, I didn't know what was next, but I knew one thing for certain. If you are not welcome somewhere, if they do not see your value and do not appreciate what you do, then you need to leave. No job, no paycheck, no title is worth sacrificing your integrity. And in that moment, I knew I had made the right decision.